Hi and welcome. My name is Jay and I'm a solution consultant at Bill. And in this video, we're going to do a deep dive into domestic AP payments with Bill's V3 APIs. AP payments are the final and most critical step of the AP workflow, where your code turns into real-world disbursements. With domestic AP payments, you settle debts and unpaid bills for vendors with a U.S. address. The Bill V3 API enables you to securely handle AP payments at scale. In this video, let's start in the Bill user interface, where we show all of the payments an organization has made. It shows the vendor name, the dates, but specifically the disbursement type. How are we paying this vendor? Via check or ACH? Bill facilitates both. We call ACH e-payment within Bill. And in this video, I want to walk through how using our APIs, we can send payments out with check or with ACH or what we call e-payment. So let's jump into Postman to describe this workflow within Bill's APIs. Before we do anything, we need to create a session within Bill's APIs. Specifically though, I need to create a trusted session. When submitting payments in Bill's APIs, you have to have a session that is trusted. To get a trusted session, it requires MFA. We're not going to go through MFA in this video. Our documentation is really good on how to get a trusted session with MFA. You'll notice that I already have my Remember Me ID here. So when I do submit this request, I'm going to get a session that is trusted. So let's go ahead and do that. There we go. I get my new session ID where trusted equals true. So before we can initiate a payment, we need a vendor. Let's go create a vendor within Bill's APIs with our vendor endpoint. Now, you can pay a vendor in Bill with just the vendor's name and address. You can also pay a vendor via ACH if you know their vendor bank information. Initially here in the first workflow, we're going to simulate a vendor that just accepts check. All I have about this vendor is their name and an address. So we're going to create this vendor Happy Music Supplies, and I'm just going to put check in the name for testing purposes here. And let's go ahead and create that vendor. And it's going to provide me a vendor ID, which I'm going to make note of. So I'm going to grab that vendor ID and make a note of it. Now, when I pay a vendor, typically it's because they've sent me a bill already. So let's create a bill for that vendor that we just created. A bill is not required to send a payment to a vendor in Bill, but we're going to explain all of that here once we get to the payments screen. So let's create a bill for that vendor, and we're going to mark that bill ID. In the response, Bill will always provide a unique ID for that object. Okay, so we have a vendor, we have a bill. Now let's submit a payment for that vendor. So I'm going to replace my vendor ID with my vendor ID here. And I'm going to replace my bill ID with the bill that I just created. You can create partial payments, so let's just pay this vendor $1 here to keep things simple. And we're going to set our process date to the next available process date, which would be 2026, March 30th. The process date in Bill is the day in which we pull the funds from the funding bank account. We have an endpoint that will describe the soonest processing date, but you also can leave process date blank, which we'll show in just a second. So we have our vendor ID, we have our bill ID, our process date is going to be Monday. We have our funding bank account ID. Some Bill clients will have multiple funding bank accounts, some will just have one. You'll define which bank account you want to fund the payment with here in our payments endpoint. So let's go ahead and submit a payment to this vendor. Now, when you get a successful payment, you'll get a payment ID response. You'll get the disbursement type, which is really important. So in this case, it is check. And you will get the single status of that payment. Single status of the payment can be scheduled, funding started, or delivered. We have detailed documentation of the single status of payments within Bill's API documentation. We also have payment webhooks you could subscribe to, and those events will be triggered based on this single status change. So if you subscribe to our payment webhooks, when that status changes, you'll be notified. Now, one thing we want to highlight here is how disbursement type is established. Disbursement type is established at the vendor level, meaning when you create that vendor, you can create that vendor as ACH disbursement or as check. Now, because we created that vendor without bank information, Bill will automatically default it to check. We can elevate that vendor to ACH two ways: by adding vendor ACH information or connecting that vendor to the vendor in Bill's network, which Bill has millions and millions of vendors in our network. There's other videos of how to connect vendors in that network so that you can pay them via ACH without having to know their bank information. We won't get into that today, but you can elevate those vendors, or you could create a new vendor with that bank information, which we're going to do in just a second. Now, before we move on, I want to also submit 2 additional payments to this vendor with changes in our APIs. First, I'm going to remove process date. You do not have to set this. If you leave it blank, Bill will default to the soonest process date that's available. So let's go ahead and initiate another payment without our process date, and you'll see the payment will still be successful. It just established the process date on its own. You also do not need a bill ID, okay? Typically in your typical AP workflow, you'll have a bill ID that you can apply to. When you set the bill ID, this will allow the vendor to see this on the remittance. So that payment will be applied to that specific bill. But if we don't have a bill ID, that's okay. We can leave it blank, but we must set create bill to true. Bill will create a dummy bill on the back end if you do not establish that bill ID. So let's go ahead and submit that payment without a process date and without a bill ID. Again, that payment is going to be created. You'll notice the process date was set, and then Bill created a dummy bill ID in the background. Now, we have created multiple checks for this vendor. Let's create a new vendor with ACH information and submit payments that way as well. Okay, so I'm going to remove my vendor endpoint here. And let's create a new vendor, and we're going to call this Happy Music Supplies ACH. Okay, and you'll see that I'm including now Happy Music Supplies vendor ACH information when I'm creating this vendor. Okay, so I'm establishing the account number and the routing number as well. I'm including that in my request. So let's go ahead and submit this and create a new ACH vendor, which it will do here. And we'll make note of that vendor. Now, before we submit a payment, I want to highlight a really important endpoint within Bill that will display all the different ways we can pay vendor with a funding mechanism and the soonest process date. This is what we call our get list of vendor payments. And I'm going to replace my vendor ID with the vendor ID that I just created. And we'll call this endpoint. And the results are all the ways in which I can pay this vendor, okay? All of my funding options. Within Bill, you can fund a payment with bank accounts and with credit cards. So here it's showing me my 2 bank accounts that I can fund this payment with. I don't have any credit cards in my Bill environment to fund payments with, so it's not displaying any. If I did, it would show. It's also going to show the soonest process date that's available. Now, you'll notice this is the 31st instead of the 30th, okay? The reason it's the 31st is because when we add a vendor with ACH information, there is a day lag in Bill to submit payments for that new vendor. This is only for new vendors. Once they're established, there is no lag, because Bill is going to send a penny test deposit to that vendor to make sure that that bank account actually exists. So it does add one extra day to our available process date when we create a new ACH vendor. All right, so let's go create that payment. Actually, we'll start from scratch here. And let's set our process date to what our payment option endpoint established, so the 31st. I'm not going to create a bill ID for this vendor just to keep things simple. And let's add our vendor ID that for our ACH vendor. We'll say this is for $1 and create bill is true. Let's submit that payment. So now we've submitted that payment for our ACH vendor. So we should see that the disbursement type is ACH, which we see down here. And we see that it is scheduled. So we've submitted checks to our check vendor. We've submitted ACHs to our ACH vendor. Now, the last thing that we want to describe in Bill is bulk payments. So what if I have multiple bills I want to pay to a vendor? I don't want to just pay one ACH for one bill. Well, we have the ability to pay multiple bills at a time. So let's create bills for our new ACH vendor. Let's create multiple bills here, which we'll do. I'm going to replace this vendor ID here, and we'll create a new bill, and I'll mark that bill ID. And let's change our invoice number to ABC and create a second bill. All right, so I've created two bills for this vendor. And now I'm going to create a bulk payment for both of those bills. So under our payments endpoint, you'll see that we also have create bulk payment. All right, and now I need to replace my bill IDs with the bill IDs that I created. So now we're paying two bills. All right, let's set our process date to the 31st like we had in our previous endpoint. We're still defining our organization bank account. We'll make these amounts $1. You don't have to do full payments here. And let's submit. So now we have a successful payment that's paying multiple bills. And in our bulk payments, you could pay up to 50 bills with one API request. In our example, the bills belong to the same vendor, but you can pay multiple bills that belong to multiple vendors with the bulk payment endpoint here. And that's it. You're now officially a domestic payment pro. Check out our full documentation at developer.bill.com for all available Bill API payment operations, including cancel payment and void payment. There's more faster payment capabilities with Bill as well that you can see in our documentation. Also, AP payments to international vendors with a non-US address are available as well, which we'll cover in another video. Happy building. Thank you.